A tense and powerful story of resilience and justice. Ethan Ross, an undercover FBI agent, boards a routine flight to Los Angeles. But when a fellow passenger, Linda Westbrook, begins targeting him with racist accusations, the atmosphere becomes charged with tension. As Linda pushes boundaries, Ethan stays calm until a shocking revelation turns the entire situation on its head. What truth does Ethan reveal, and how will this confrontation end? To find out, like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping stories. Ethan Ross stepped into the bustling terminal at JFK International Airport, his eyes scanning the large crowd milling about the departure gates. He was dressed casually today. Dark jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a pair of worn leather boots. His usual FBI uniform, a sharp suit and tie, was tucked away in his suitcase, along with his badge. Today wasn't about standing out. Today was about blending in. He could hear the familiar voice of a gate agent over the intercom, calling passengers to board flight 862 to Los Angeles. His gate was nearby, and as he made his way there, he reflected on the mission that awaited him in LA. A high-profile criminal case, months in the making, and Ethan was one of the key players. But for now, the mission felt far off. All he had to do was get on this flight, read a few chapters of his book, and relax. He deserved that much, didn't he? As Ethan reached the boarding area, he slipped his headphones on, letting the soothing hum of jazz drown out the noise around him. Miles Davis, his go-to when he needed to center himself. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, which carried nothing but essentials: a book, noise-canceling headphones, his wallet, and a few snacks for the flight. Ethan glanced up at the line of passengers filing into the plane. It was a full flight, and the passengers were as diverse as any crowd in New York. A melting pot of tourists, business travelers, families, and people of all walks of life. Ethan liked that. It made it easier to disappear in plain sight. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass, giving him a polite nod. "Enjoy your flight, sir." "Thanks," Ethan replied, flashing a quick smile before heading down the jet bridge. As he boarded the plane, the familiar smell of recycled air and worn-out upholstery hit his senses. He found his seat, 18C, an aisle seat in economy, near the middle of the cabin. He was glad for it. He liked the freedom of the aisle, the ability to stretch his legs when needed, and, if necessary, a quick exit. Old habits died hard. Ethan tossed his backpack into the overhead bin and sat down, settling into the narrow seat. The seatbelt light was still off, and he used the few remaining minutes before takeoff to scroll through his phone. A quick check-in with his supervisor, Mike Sanders, to confirm the details for his upcoming mission. Landing in LA at 6:30 p.m., heading to the briefing after that. Everything ready on your end? He hit send and pocketed his phone, his thoughts briefly lingering on the mission. It was nothing out of the ordinary for him. Just another case. But something about this one felt different, bigger. He shook the thought off and leaned back, looking out the window as other passengers found their seats. The noise in the cabin grew louder, the familiar chaos of boarding a full flight. A mother nearby struggled to calm her crying toddler, while a couple in the row ahead of Ethan argued over where to store their oversized carry-on. Typical. But then, as if on cue, something shifted. Linda Westbrook swept down the aisle of the plane as if she owned the place. She was in her mid-50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and dressed head to toe in designer labels. Her gold jewelry glinted under the cabin lights, and the cloying scent of her expensive perfume followed in her wake. Ethan didn't need to hear her speak to know who she was. He'd seen her type before, entitled, loud, always complaining about something. He'd dealt with enough people like her in his line of work to spot them a mile away. Linda's presence was already being felt by the cabin crew, who were doing their best to accommodate her. One of the flight attendants, a woman in her early 30s with a neat ponytail and a weary smile, hurried to assist as Linda complained loudly about her seat. "This is ridiculous," Linda huffed. "I paid for first-class comfort, and this seat is far from acceptable. I demand you move me somewhere else." The flight attendant, Jane Palmer, maintained her professional smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're at full capacity today. I'll do what I can to make your flight more comfortable." Linda sniffed, clearly unimpressed with the response. "This isn't the service I expect from an airline like this. I'll be filing a complaint once we land. Ethan closed his eyes and turned up the volume on his headphones. Not today, he thought. He wasn't in the mood for drama, not before a 6-hour flight. He would stay in his lane, read his book, and stay out of trouble. But trouble, as he'd learned over the years, had a way of finding him. Once the plane began taxiing down the runway, the tension in the cabin seemed to settle slightly. Passengers were buckled in, the overhead bins secured, and the engines roared to life. Ethan exhaled slowly as the plane lifted off, watching the ground fall away beneath them. For a brief moment, there was peace. He let himself relax, pulling out his book and flipping to the page he'd left off on. The jazz in his headphones lulled him into a state of calm, and he felt the tightness in his shoulders ease as they reached cruising altitude. But that peace didn't last long. About an hour into the flight, just as the attendants were beginning to serve drinks, Ethan caught the sharp edge of a familiar voice. "This is outrageous." Linda's voice rose above the quiet murmur of the passengers. "I specifically asked for sparkling water, and this is what you give me?" Ethan sighed, glancing across the aisle. Linda was holding up a can of soda as though it were toxic, her face contorted with disgust. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant stammered, clearly flustered. "We've run out of sparkling water. I can offer you—" "No, no, no," Linda interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "I paid for this flight. I expect the service I'm entitled to." Several passengers had begun to watch the exchange, some with annoyance, others with a detached curiosity. Ethan, however, kept his focus on his book. He'd seen scenes like this play out before. The best way to handle people like Linda was to stay out of their way. But it was about to get worse. As the flight attendant moved away, doing her best to maintain her composure, Linda's sharp gaze scanned the cabin. Her eyes landed on Ethan, who was now standing to stretch his legs. "Excuse me," Linda snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "You in the aisle. Sit down." Ethan glanced at her, confused. He wasn't in the aisle. He was standing near his seat, making sure not to block anyone's path. "I'm not in the aisle, ma'am," he said calmly. "Just stretching." Linda's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Don't ma'am me. I've been watching you since we boarded. You people always think you can do whatever you want." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He'd heard those words before, too many times. But here, in the tight confines of the plane, surrounded by dozens of silent passengers, it hit differently. He felt the eyes on him, the weight of the cabin's collective attention pressing down. He stayed calm, though. Years of training in the FBI had taught him how to handle situations like this. "I'm just trying to fly like everyone else," he replied, his voice steady. Linda wasn't satisfied. "People like you always play the victim," she sneered. "You think you're entitled to everything." The cabin fell silent, the murmurs of passengers ceasing as the tension grew thick in the air. Ethan felt the familiar stir of anger in his chest, but he kept it down, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He wasn't about to let her get the best of him. As Linda continued her tirade, accusing Ethan of staring at her, the flight attendants hovered nearby, clearly unsure of how to intervene. The rest of the passengers sat frozen, eyes darting between Linda and Ethan, waiting for something to happen. Ethan could feel the anger rising, his fists clenching at his sides. But he knew he couldn't react. He had to stay calm, to keep control. Before he could respond, a voice from behind him cut through the tension. "Lady, you need to calm down." It was Oliver Scott, a tall man in his early 40s with broad shoulders and a deep, authoritative voice. He stood up from his seat, his eyes fixed on Linda. "You're out of line." Linda whirled around, glaring at him. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down. I'm the one being harassed here." "You're not being harassed," Oliver shot back. "You're making a scene." A few passengers murmured in agreement, nodding their heads as the tide slowly turned against Linda. She crossed her arms, her face flushed with anger. But it was clear she was losing control of the situation. With Oliver's intervention, Linda's aggression seemed to momentarily simmer down. She retreated to her seat, muttering under her breath and casting venomous glances in Ethan's direction. But for now, the immediate confrontation has been diffused. Ethan sat back down, feeling the tension in his muscles begin to release. He glanced over at Oliver and gave him a small nod of thanks, but his thoughts were still racing. He dealt with worse than this, far worse. But it didn't make the sting of Linda's words any easier to bear. The plane continued its journey west, the hum of the engines filling the cabin once more as the passengers settled back into their routines. Drinks were served, conversations resumed, and it seemed as though the situation had returned to normal. But Ethan knew better. Linda wasn't finished. Despite Oliver's intervention, the uneasy silence that followed didn't last long. Ethan could still feel the cold burn of Linda's eyes on him. The plane had settled back into its routine, flight attendants passing through the aisles with drink carts, passengers chatting quietly, the hum of the engines in the background. But Ethan knew the tension wasn't over. He glanced around at the other passengers, many of whom were still stealing furtive glances in his direction. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Was he really the problem, or was it Linda? Ethan tried to focus on his book, but the words blurred together. He felt restless. There was no room to escape the situation, not physically and not mentally. The tight confines of the airplane only amplified the discomfort, like a pressure cooker slowly building up heat. Linda's muttering continued from her seat behind him. She was speaking softly but loud enough for those nearby to hear. She wanted to make sure they heard. "These people," she whispered, though her words were far from subtle. "They act like they own the place. No respect for others. I don't know why they even let people like that on planes." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't turn around, didn't react. He'd been trained not to. Years of FBI training had taught him how to handle high-pressure situations, how to keep a level head when tensions were at their peak. But this was different. This wasn't just a criminal case or a dangerous operation. This was personal, and it was public. He could hear a few passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, trying to pretend they weren't listening, but everyone was. The air felt thick, like something ugly and dangerous was brewing just beneath the surface. He knew that if he reacted, if he stood up and confronted her directly, it would only escalate the situation. People like Linda thrived on confrontation. They wanted someone to lash out, to give them the justification to scream louder, to make themselves the victim. And Ethan wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. The minutes dragged on. Ethan kept his focus forward, but the tension inside him continued to mount. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on breathing, trying to calm the rising frustration that threatened to boil over. "Just stay calm," he reminded himself. "Don't let her get to you." But Linda wasn't finished. Her voice rose again, this time louder and more pointed. "You know what people like him are always doing," she said to no one in particular. "They think they can get away with anything. They think they don't have to follow the rules. And if you say something about it, they play the victim. Every time." Ethan's fists clenched in his lap. His patience was wearing thin. He wasn't a violent man. He didn't believe in responding to hate with more hate, but he wasn't a saint either. Every human had their limits, and Ethan's were being tested. He could feel the other passengers waiting, watching. Some of them nodded subtly in agreement with Linda's words, while others simply looked uncomfortable. No one stood up. No one said a word. They were all waiting for him to do something. Just let it go, he thought. Don't make a scene. But the fire inside him was burning hotter, and Linda could sense it. She stood up again, this time turning directly toward Ethan, her voice dripping with condescension. "People like you are the reason this country's going downhill." Ethan stayed seated. He didn't look up at her, but his muscles were tense, his heart racing. "What? Nothing to say," she sneered. "I thought so. Just like all the rest. You think you're above the rules, but when someone calls you out on it, you don't have the guts to defend yourself." The tension reached its breaking point. Ethan felt his body shift, instinctively preparing to stand. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. He only knew he couldn't sit there and let this woman humiliate him in front of everyone. He had to say something. He had to defend himself, even if it meant risking the escalation. But before he could make a move, someone else did. The man sitting next to Linda, a quiet, middle-aged man in a business suit who had been trying to ignore the situation for the past hour, finally spoke up. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and tense, "I think you've said enough." Linda whipped around to face him, her eyes wide with shock. "Excuse me?" "I said you've said enough," the man repeated. He looked nervous, like he regretted speaking up but couldn't stop himself. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Just let it go. Linda's face flushed red with fury. Who do you think you are? She snapped. You don't know anything about this situation. You don't know who he is. He's a danger to all of us, and you're just going to sit there and let him get away with it? The man shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable but determined not to back down. He's not a danger to anyone. You're the one causing a problem here. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, a mixture of relief and anxiety building inside him. On one hand, he was grateful that someone else had spoken up on his behalf. On the other, he knew that Linda wasn't the type to back down easily. Sure enough, she turned her venom back on him. Oh, I get it. You're all on his side, huh? I should have known. You people always stick together. The man in the business suit shook his head, his frustration clear. This has nothing to do with sides. You're being unreasonable. Linda sneered at him. You're all blind, she spat. You don't know what people like him are capable of. The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Ethan felt them cut deep, the weight of a lifetime of prejudice and assumptions pressing down on him. He was done staying silent. Ethan stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow over the rows of seats in front of him. The cabin fell deathly quiet as every pair of eyes turned to watch. He could feel their attention, their anticipation. They were waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to respond. Linda crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smug smile as if she had already won. You've got something to say? She taunted, her voice dripping with condescension. Ethan locked eyes with her, his voice low but firm. I've been sitting here minding my own business, just like everyone else. You're the only one making this into something it doesn't need to be. Linda scoffed. Oh, please, don't act like you're some innocent bystander. I know your type. You always act like you're above the rules, like nothing applies to you. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let her push him into losing control. Ma'am, he said, his voice measured, you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. So I'd suggest you stop making assumptions. The tension in the cabin grew thicker with every passing second. The other passengers were on edge, their eyes flicking between Ethan and Linda, unsure of what would happen next. Linda's face twisted with rage. Oh, I know enough. I know what people like you do. You cause trouble wherever you go. You think you can get away with anything because no one has the guts to stand up to you. Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm, but it was getting harder. He could feel the weight of all the passengers' eyes on him, the pressure to handle this situation with grace and composure. He couldn't afford to let his emotions get the best of him. Not here, not now. But before he could respond, another voice rang out from the back of the plane. That's enough. Jane Palmer, the head flight attendant, stepped forward, her face tight with professional authority. She had watched the situation escalate, her nerves frayed, but now it was clear that she had no choice but to intervene. Ma'am, Jane said, addressing Linda directly, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down and stop causing a disturbance. Linda's face turned a shade of red Ethan had only seen a few times in his life, usually when someone was about to completely lose control. Are you kidding me? Linda screeched, her voice high-pitched and furious. You're taking his side? You're supposed to be here to keep us safe, and you're just going to let him sit there and do whatever he wants? Ma'am, Jane repeated, her voice firm, you're disturbing the other passengers. If you continue to cause a scene, we'll have no choice but to take further action. The threat of further action seemed to make Linda hesitate for a moment. Her eyes darted around the cabin as if she were looking for someone to back her up, but no one came to her defense. Even the passengers who had remained silent throughout the ordeal were now watching her with a mixture of discomfort and annoyance. Realizing that she had lost control of the situation, Linda reluctantly sat back down, her arms crossed and her face twisted with anger, but it was clear that she wasn't finished. This isn't over, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for those around her to hear. Not by a long shot. For a brief moment, it seemed like the situation had been diffused. The passengers slowly began to relax, and the hum of conversation picked back up in the cabin. The flight attendants resumed their service, walking down the aisles with drinks and snacks, trying to pretend that everything was back to normal. But Ethan knew better. Linda was still fuming in her seat, casting bitter glances his way every few minutes. Her muttering had grown quieter, but it was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. She wasn't going to let this go. Not yet. Ethan leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes and taking slow, deep breaths. He had to stay calm. He had to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't the time to lose control, but the weight of the situation was pressing down on him, heavier with every passing minute. The public humiliation, the blatant racism, the fact that no one had intervened sooner, it all gnawed at him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He had dealt with worse, of course. He had faced far more dangerous situations in his career as an FBI agent, situations where lives were on the line. But this was different. This was personal, and it hurt in a way that no amount of training could prepare him for. Just when Ethan thought the situation might have finally settled down, Linda stood up again. This time, she was more determined than ever. Without waiting for the flight attendants to intervene, she marched toward the front of the plane, cutting through the aisle with a look of pure determination on her face. "I need to speak to the pilot," she declared, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This plane isn't safe." The flight attendant, Jane, rushed forward to intercept her. "Ma'am, you need to sit down. The seatbelt sign is on." Linda ignored her. "I don't care. That man back there is a threat, and you're all just sitting here doing nothing. I want him off this plane." The cabin fell into chaos. Passengers began whispering to each other, some looking at Ethan with suspicion, others with disbelief. The tension had reached a boiling point, and everyone could feel it. Ethan remained seated, his fists clenched in his lap. He could feel the stares of the passengers boring into him, but he didn't react. He had to stay calm. He couldn't afford to make the situation any worse than it already was. Jane, her face tight with frustration, turned to Linda. "Ma'am, if you don't return to your seat, we will have to call security once we land." Linda's face twisted with rage. "Good," she spat. "Call security. Let's see how long he lasts when they realize who he really is." The pilot, Captain Richard Miles, had finally had enough. He stepped out of the cockpit, his expression one of controlled annoyance, as he approached the scene unfolding at the front of the plane. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Linda wasted no time. "The problem is that man," she said, pointing directly at Ethan. "He's a threat to all of us, and no one here is doing anything about it." The captain glanced at Ethan, then back at Linda. "Ma'am, please calm down. There is no indication that anyone on this flight is a danger." Linda's face flushed red with frustration. "Are you serious? You're just going to ignore me?" The captain's patience was wearing thin. "If you do not return to your seat immediately, I will have no choice but to call airport security to escort you off this plane when we land." For a moment, Linda seemed to waver. She looked around the cabin, realizing that no one was on her side anymore. The passengers were done with her outbursts, and even the man sitting next to her had turned away, clearly wanting nothing more to do with her. With a huff, Linda stormed back to her seat, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. The tension in the cabin slowly began to ease, but Ethan knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ethan sat in silence, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. He could feel the weight of the entire cabin's attention on him, as if every passenger was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Linda's final outburst had brought the tension in the air to a suffocating high, and the silence that followed felt more oppressive than her screams. As the flight continued its descent, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach toward Los Angeles. But the calm felt forced, artificial. Even as the engines hummed steadily and the flight attendants resumed their duties, everyone was still on edge. Linda hadn't spoken since her confrontation with the pilot. She sat stiffly in her seat, her eyes burning with resentment. Her face was flushed, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white against her skin. Ethan could feel her gaze on him, a glare so full of contempt that it sent a chill down his spine. He knew what she was thinking. She wasn't finished. Not yet. And she wasn't the only one. Ethan could sense the growing discomfort among the other passengers, the way they kept glancing between him and Linda, unsure of what to do. It was the uncertainty that fueled the tension, the fear of not knowing how or when the situation would erupt again. Some passengers shifted nervously in their seats, their eyes darting toward the flight attendants as if hoping they'd intervene again before things escalated further. But no one moved, no one spoke. Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had been trained to handle situations like this, to remain calm under pressure. But the personal nature of Linda's attacks had struck a nerve. It wasn't just her words, it was the fact that she had the audacity to say them in front of everyone. She had singled him out, humiliated him, and no one had stood up for him until it had become impossible to ignore. He had expected more. He had hoped that in a situation like this, people would step up, do the right thing. But most of them had stayed silent, and that silence stung. As the plane began its final approach, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp click of a seatbelt being unbuckled. He looked up just in time to see Linda standing again, her eyes blazing with indignation. "I'm not going to sit here and let this happen," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "I want him removed from this flight as soon as we land." The murmur of voices that had been steadily growing in the cabin suddenly stopped. Everyone turned to look at her, some in disbelief, others in resignation. Ethan could feel the heat rising in his chest, a familiar anger that he had spent years learning how to control. Linda pointed a trembling finger at him. "I don't care what the captain says. I don't feel safe with him on this plane." Ethan remained seated, his expression neutral, though his pulse raced. He had learned a long time ago not to give people like Linda the reaction they wanted, but it was taking everything in him not to stand up and tell her exactly what he thought of her. Several passengers gasped audibly at her accusation, and Ethan could hear the whispers growing louder. A few seats ahead, a young woman, Sarah Kelly, who had been quietly watching the entire situation unfold, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, you need to stop," Sarah said, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "You're making everyone else uncomfortable." Linda turned on her heel, glaring at the woman. "Excuse me, you have no idea what you're talking about. I'm the one being made uncomfortable, not you. This is about my safety. That man," she pointed at Ethan again, "is a danger to everyone on this plane, and no one is doing anything about it." Sarah shook her head, refusing to back down. "No one's in danger. You're the only one acting like this is some kind of crisis. Just sit down, please." The cabin was utterly silent now. The tension stretched so tight it felt like it could snap at any moment. Ethan could see the conflict brewing in the faces of the other passengers. Some were siding with Sarah, nodding in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond to Linda's hysteria. The plane gave a small shudder as it descended, and the flight attendants hurried to finish their final safety checks. Jane Palmer, who had intervened earlier, moved swiftly down the aisle, her face pale with frustration. "Ma'am, this is your final warning," Jane said as she approached Linda. "You need to sit down right now. We are about to land and you cannot stand up during descent." But Linda was too far gone to listen to reason. "I will not sit down. I want him removed from this plane the second we land, or I'm calling the police." A ripple of shock spread through the cabin at her threat. Some passengers began muttering amongst themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading. Ethan, however, remained calm. He had dealt with situations far more dangerous and volatile than this one, but the sheer audacity of Linda's accusations left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. She had called him a threat, demanded his removal from the plane, all because she felt entitled to her own twisted sense of superiority. He wasn't going to let her win. "I haven't done anything," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't engage with her more than necessary. He was tired of playing her game. Linda turned toward him, her eyes wild with indignation. "Of course you haven't. You people never think you've done anything wrong." Her words hit like a slap. Ethan felt the air rush out of his lungs, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, he came dangerously close to losing his composure. But before he could react, the young woman, Sarah, stood up. "Are you serious?" Sarah said, her voice filled with disbelief. "You're making this about race," Linda sneered. "Don't pretend like you don't know what I mean. He's probably not even supposed to be on this flight. For all we know, he's a criminal." The moment the word criminal left Linda's mouth, the energy in the cabin shifted. The passengers, who had been uncertain, Those who had quietly observed without taking sides now seemed to recoil in disgust. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with judgment and condemnation. Ethan felt his heart race. He had experienced prejudice in many forms over the years, but this was different. This wasn't whispered slurs or subtle microaggressions. This was a blatant, public attack on his character, on who he was as a person, and it was happening in front of an entire plane full of people. And still, no one had fully stood up for him. Until now. Just when it seemed like the tension had reached its breaking point, Oliver Scott, the man who had defended Ethan earlier, stood up once more. His broad frame blocked Linda's view as he turned to face her directly. "That's enough," Oliver said, his voice steady and calm, but filled with an authority that silenced Linda's rant. Linda blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You need to sit down," Oliver continued. "You've been harassing him this entire flight, and no one's done anything to stop you. But we're all sick of it. You've gone too far." A ripple of agreement spread through the cabin. Several passengers nodded, murmuring their support for Oliver's words. "You think you're protecting everyone here? But the only person who's made this flight unbearable is you," Oliver said, his voice rising slightly. "We're all tired of your nonsense. Just sit down and let us land in peace." For the first time, Linda looked uncertain. Her eyes flicked around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, to back her. But all she saw were the cold stares of passengers who had finally turned against her. Even the man sitting next to her, who had tried to remain neutral for most of the flight, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly embarrassed by the entire ordeal. Ethan watched as Linda's face turned a deep shade of red, her mouth opening and closing, as if she were searching for something to say. But the words didn't come. She had finally run out of steam. The plane tilted slightly as it continued its descent, and Jane, the flight attendant, seized the moment. "Ma'am, please return to your seat now," Jane said firmly. "We are preparing to land, and you cannot stand during this time. This is your final warning." Linda hesitated for a moment longer, clearly fighting the urge to argue, but the collective weight of the passengers' stares bore down on her. She wasn't winning this fight. Not anymore. With a huff, Linda finally turned and stormed back to her seat, collapsing into it with a loud sigh of frustration. Her face was flushed with anger and humiliation, but for the first time since the ordeal began, she said nothing. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but there was a palpable sense of relief as the plane finally began its final approach to Los Angeles. The passengers, exhausted from the drama that had unfolded over the last few hours, shifted in their seats, preparing for the landing. Ethan, however, remained still. His mind raced, replaying the events over and over again. He had stayed calm, kept his composure, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. Linda's words had cut deep, and even though the situation had been diffused for now, he knew that the real confrontation was yet to come. As the plane touched down with a soft bump, the tension seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The passengers were relieved to have landed, but Ethan knew this wasn't over. Not yet. He could feel it in his bones. There was one final confrontation ahead, and it would come the moment the plane's doors opened. The plane's tires touched down with a soft bump, sending a subtle vibration through the cabin. Passengers let out a collective breath of relief. The long, tense flight was finally coming to an end, and everyone could feel the shift in energy. The rumbling of the engines as they slowed on the tarmac was like a soothing balm after hours of barely contained anxiety. Ethan sat still, watching as the other passengers started to fidget with their seatbelts and phones, eager to exit the aircraft. The tension that had filled the cabin seemed to lift, but it wasn't gone. It was as though everyone was waiting for the final shoe to drop. Linda sat stiffly in her seat, arms crossed, eyes forward. But Ethan could still feel the heat of her anger. She hadn't said a word since Oliver and the rest of the passengers had turned against her, but she hadn't let it go either. Her face was still red, her lips pursed into a thin, tight line. She was waiting, biding her time. Ethan had been in enough volatile situations to know that the real storm often hit after the calm. He had seen suspects who, after hours of interrogation, seemed to surrender only to lash out in the final moments. The tension in Linda's posture, the way she sat so rigidly, gave him the same feeling now. He kept his eyes straight ahead, hands resting in his lap, trying to focus on what came next. Once the plane came to a full stop, he would disembark, meet with his FBI colleagues, and move on to the mission. The weight of that mission had been hanging over him the entire flight, and now it was just a matter of staying composed until he could leave. But as the plane taxied toward the gate, the soft chatter of passengers started to reassemble their belongings filled the air. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't fully anticipate. The plane came to a stop at the gate, and with a soft chime, the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers immediately began unbuckling, standing, and pulling their bags from the overhead compartments. Ethan remained seated, allowing the chaos of disembarkation to unfold around him. He wasn't in any rush. If anything, he preferred to let others leave first, to avoid unnecessary interactions. But as he sat, he noticed Linda's movement out of the corner of his eye. She stood abruptly, yanking her bag from the overhead compartment with a force that drew the attention of the passengers around her. Ethan's muscles tensed. The way she moved, hurried, deliberately set off alarm bells in his mind. "I want to speak to the pilot," Linda declared loudly, her voice slicing through the murmur of passengers preparing to leave. "Now." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, the tired resignation of the passengers turning back into discomfort. Several heads turned to look at her, some rolling their eyes, others murmuring under their breath. The flight attendants, who had been preparing to assist with the deplaning process, looked at each other with exasperation. Jane Palmer, the head flight attendant, stepped forward, blocking Linda's path to the front of the plane. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. The plane is at the gate, and you'll be able to speak to the pilot once everyone has exited." Linda glared at her, her lips curling into a sneer. "I'm not waiting. I need to speak to him now. This is a serious matter. That man," she pointed once more at Ethan, her voice rising in volume, "is a threat. You're putting all of us in danger by ignoring it." The words hung in the air like a bad smell, filling the cabin with a fresh wave of discomfort. Passengers shifted in their seats, clearly torn between their exhaustion and their lingering curiosity over the drama that refused to end. Ethan's jaw clenched, his patience fraying at the edges. He had kept his cool throughout the flight, refusing to let Linda's baseless accusations and racial jabs push him to the breaking point. But now, with the plane on the ground, the threat of being dragged into a confrontation with security or law enforcement was becoming all too real. He glanced at the flight attendants, who were visibly frazzled by Linda's persistence. They were trained to de-escalate situations like this, but Linda was relentless. Her entitlement was like a battering ram, pounding against the limits of their professionalism. For a moment, it seemed like Jane might lose control of the situation. But then, a voice from behind Ethan broke through the tension. "Just let it go, lady." It was Oliver again, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. He stood in the aisle, his face set with a firm determination. He wasn't as calm as he had been earlier. There was a weariness in his eyes, a frustration that had been building throughout the entire flight. "You've made your point," Oliver said, his voice low and even, but filled with barely restrained irritation. "Now just let us all get off this plane and move on with our lives." Linda whipped around to face him, her eyes blazing. "Excuse me? I have every right to speak to the pilot about a safety concern." "Safety concern?" Oliver laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The only danger here is you harassing everyone on this plane." Several passengers murmured in agreement, nodding their heads or exchanging glances. It was clear that most of them were fed up with Linda's behavior. They were tired, they wanted to leave, and they had no patience left for her outbursts. Even the flight attendants seemed to sense the shift in the cabin. Jane, who had been trying to remain calm and professional throughout the ordeal, glanced at the other attendants, silently asking for their support. "Ma'am," Jane said, her voice firmer now, "you need to return to your seat and allow the other passengers to exit. If you don't comply, we will have to call security." The mention of security seemed to rattle Linda. Her eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, where the door was still closed, and then back to Ethan. For a brief moment, Ethan saw something in her face that almost looked like fear, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar mask of entitlement and rage. "I'm not afraid of security," Linda spat, her voice rising again. In fact, I want them to come. They need to remove him from this plane before something happens. The tension in the cabin spiked again, and Ethan could feel the eyes of the other passengers turning toward him. Even though most of them were clearly on his side now, the weight of their stares still pressed down on him, making his skin crawl. He had dealt with worse, he reminded himself. But this wasn't just about staying calm under pressure. This was about public humiliation, about being singled out and dehumanized in front of dozens of people simply because of the color of his skin. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He knew what would happen next if he didn't handle this carefully. If security was called, if things escalated, it could lead to a far bigger problem than Linda's baseless accusations. The last thing he needed was to be dragged off the plane in front of everyone, forced to explain himself while Linda stood there, vindicated in her own twisted mind. He had his FBI badge in his pocket, but he wasn't ready to reveal it just yet. Not until it became absolutely necessary. Flashing his credentials too soon could complicate things, and the situation was already teetering on the edge of chaos. As the other passengers began to file out of the plane, Ethan remained seated, watching the interaction between Linda and the flight attendants unfold. He could sense the frustration building in Jane and the rest of the crew, but they were trying their best to keep things under control. "Ma'am," Jane said again, her patience clearly wearing thin, "please return to your seat. We'll speak with the pilot after the other passengers have deplaned." But Linda wouldn't back down. "I'm not sitting down until something is done about him," she said, her voice loud and grating. "He's a threat to everyone here, and you're just letting him walk off this plane like it's no big deal." At that moment, Ethan made his decision. He wasn't going to let this go any further. He had stayed quiet, stayed calm, but now it was time to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of hand. Slowly, he stood up. The cabin grew silent again as Ethan rose from his seat, his tall frame commanding attention. He could feel the eyes of the remaining passengers on him, the tension thick in the air. Linda stared at him, her eyes narrowing as if daring him to speak. Ethan turned toward her, his voice calm and steady, but with a quiet authority that made everyone stop and listen. "I've been patient," he said. "I've stayed quiet, I've followed the rules, and I've let you say whatever you wanted to say. But this needs to end now." Linda opened her mouth to interrupt, but Ethan didn't give her the chance. "You've accused me of being a threat," he continued, his voice rising just slightly. "You've made assumptions about me without knowing a single thing about who I am. And you've put everyone on this plane through hell because of your own fears and prejudices." The passengers who were still on the plane nodded quietly in agreement. Linda's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing. "I am not a threat," Ethan said, his eyes locked on Linda's. "But if you keep pushing this, you'll find out very quickly that I'm not someone you want to provoke." There was a weight to his words that hung in the air, a quiet warning that made the remaining passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. They didn't know who Ethan was or what he did for a living, but they could sense that he wasn't just another passenger. For a moment, Linda seemed to falter. Her eyes flicked toward the flight attendants, then toward the other passengers, as if she were trying to gauge whether she still had the upper hand. But it was clear that the tide had turned. The passengers were done with her. Even the flight attendants, who had tried so hard to stay neutral, were now standing in quiet solidarity with Ethan. Ethan didn't break eye contact with Linda, his gaze steady and unyielding. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him any longer. This needed to end, and he was going to make sure of it. Just as the tension in the cabin reached its breaking point, there was a knock on the door at the front of the plane. The flight attendants moved quickly to open it, and two uniformed security officers stepped inside. Linda's face lit up with a smug satisfaction, as if she had finally won. "There they are," she said, pointing at Ethan. "That's the man I've been telling you about. You need to remove him from this plane right now." The security officers exchanged a glance, clearly confused by the scene in front of them. They had been called to deal with a disturbance, but it was unclear who the real source of the problem was. Jane, the head flight attendant, stepped forward to explain the situation, her voice low and controlled. "We've had a bit of an issue with one of our passengers," she said, gesturing subtly toward Linda. "She's been causing a disturbance and refusing to comply with our requests." The security officers looked from Jane to Linda, then back to Ethan, who remained calm and collected, standing in the aisle. One of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, can you come with us for a moment?" the officer asked, his tone polite but firm. Ethan nodded, already knowing what needed to happen. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his FBI badge. The security officer's eyes widened slightly, his demeanor shifting instantly. "I'm Special Agent Ethan Ross," Ethan said calmly. "I'm on official business, heading to Los Angeles for an assignment. If you'd like to verify my identity, feel free to contact my supervisor." The second officer, who had been watching from the front of the plane, stepped closer to inspect the badge. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Agent Ross, I'm so sorry," the officer stammered. "We didn't realize—" "It's fine," Ethan said, his voice measured. "You're just doing your job. But I'd appreciate it if we could handle this situation quietly." Linda's face went pale. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, she looked genuinely shocked. Her mouth hung open, words failing her as she stared at the badge in Ethan's hand. "You're FBI?" she sputtered. Ethan turned to her, his eyes cold and unflinching. "Yes, and now you can deal with the consequences of your actions." For the first time since the plane had left New York, Linda was completely silent. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and stunned. The smugness, the sense of superiority she had worn so proudly during the entire flight, had evaporated in an instant. She stared at Ethan's FBI badge, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the words to justify herself. "You're FBI?" she repeated, her voice a barely audible whisper now. Confidence had fled, leaving behind only shock and disbelief. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The rest of the passengers sat frozen in place, eyes wide, watching in stunned silence. The revelation had landed like a bomb, shattering whatever support Linda had hoped to garner from her fellow passengers. The tide had fully turned against her now, and there was no coming back. The security officers, who had initially approached Ethan with suspicion, now stood at attention, clearly understanding the gravity of their mistake. One of them cleared his throat and stepped forward, speaking directly to Ethan. "Agent Ross, we sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding," the officer said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "We had no idea you were on official business." Ethan nodded, his voice calm and controlled. "No harm done," he said. "But I'd like this situation to be resolved quickly. We've already wasted enough time." The officer nodded, his face flushed. "Of course. We'll take care of it." Ethan turned his attention back to Linda, who had remained standing, her eyes wide and her lips trembling. She was struggling to process what had just happened, and the reality of the situation seemed to hit her all at once. Her posture, once so defiant and haughty, now sagged under the weight of her actions. You didn't tell me," she stammered, her voice shaking. "You didn't say anything about being FBI." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the frustration, the anger that had been simmering inside him for hours, threatening to bubble over. But he forced himself to stay calm. He had learned long ago that people like Linda would never understand the impact of their words and actions. They lived in a world where they believed they were always right, where the rules didn't apply to them, and they expected everyone else to fall in line. "I didn't owe you an explanation," Ethan said, his voice measured but firm. "I'm just a man trying to fly to Los Angeles like everyone else. You turned this into something it didn't need to be." Linda's face flushed with embarrassment, but she didn't give up. She wasn't the type to admit she was wrong, not even when the truth was staring her in the face. She shook her head, her voice rising in pitch again. "I was only trying to protect everyone. I didn't know who you were. You could have been dangerous." Ethan's eyes narrowed. The sheer audacity of her words, the idea that she still believed she was on the right, made his blood boil. "I've heard that excuse before," Ethan said quietly. "People like you always think they're protecting something when really, you're just protecting your own ignorance." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Every single passenger was watching the confrontation unfold, and it was clear that no one was on Linda's side anymore. Even the flight attendants, who had remained professional and composed throughout the ordeal, were exchanging uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to intervene. Linda, for her part, seemed to sense that she was losing control of the situation. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone who might support her. But the cold stares she received in return told her everything she needed to know. She was alone. I didn't mean for this to happen, Linda muttered, her voice shaking. I thought... You thought wrong, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. He had no interest in humiliating her further. This wasn't about revenge. It was about holding her accountable for the damage she had caused. Linda swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she might actually apologize, if she might finally realize the consequences of her actions. But instead, she simply dropped her gaze, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The security officers stepped forward, one of them gently placing a hand on Linda's arm. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. Linda didn't resist. She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to fight anymore. She allowed herself to be guided toward the front of the plane, her head bowed, her once proud demeanor now crumbled into dust. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Linda was escorted off the plane. The relief in the cabin was palpable, like a heavy weight had been lifted from the air. But no one cheered. No one clapped. It wasn't a victory. It was simply the end of something ugly. As the doors to the plane finally opened and the passengers began to deplane, Ethan remained in his seat, allowing the others to exit first. He needed a moment to collect himself, to breathe. The adrenaline that had been coursing through his veins was starting to fade, leaving him feeling both exhausted and relieved. The cabin was almost empty now, with only a few passengers remaining. Ethan stood slowly, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment. As he turned to leave, he noticed that Sarah, the young woman who had stood up for him earlier, was waiting at the back of the plane, her eyes filled with concern. "Hey," she said softly as Ethan approached. "Are you okay?" Ethan nodded, though he could feel the weight of everything that had happened still pressing down on him. "Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for speaking up earlier. I appreciate it." Sarah smiled, though it was a sad, tired smile. "I couldn't just sit there and watch that happen. What she said, it wasn't right." Ethan nodded, grateful for her words but still feeling the sting of the experience. He had been through worse, of course, far worse. But every time something like this happened, it left a scar, a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were still people who would see him as less than human, just because of the color of his skin. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "It never is." There was a brief silence between them, the hum of the now quiet cabin filling the space. Sarah glanced around, then back at Ethan. "It's not fair," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "You shouldn't have to deal with that." Ethan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Life's not fair," he said, "but I've learned to pick my battles." Sarah nodded, clearly still upset by everything that had happened, but she didn't press him further. She could sense that he was tired, both physically and emotionally, and she respected that. "Well," she said, offering him a small, genuine smile, "I'm glad you're okay, and I hope the rest of your trip goes smoothly." "Thanks," Ethan said, returning the smile. "You too." With that, they both turned to leave the plane, stepping into the cool air of the terminal. The flight was over, but the weight of the experience lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. As Ethan made his way through the terminal, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a message from his supervisor, Mike Sanders. "You landed yet? Meeting at 7:30. Let's make this one count." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of normalcy return. The mission that awaited him in Los Angeles was crucial. High stakes, with months of planning and coordination behind it. And now that the flight was over, he could finally shift his focus back to work that really mattered. He texted back quickly. "Just landed. I'll be there." Slipping his phone back into his pocket, Ethan walked through the terminal with a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Linda had been draining, both physically and emotionally, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had reminded him of why he did what he did, why he had chosen to become an FBI agent in the first place. There would always be people like Linda, people who judged others based on skin color, who clung to their prejudices and fears. But there were also people like Sarah, people who stood up for what was right. even when it wasn't easy. And then there was Ethan, someone who had fought his way through adversity, who had proven time and time again that he was more than the assumptions people made about him. He wasn't just an FBI agent. He wasn't just another passenger on a plane. He was a man who had faced ignorance and hatred and came out on the other side stronger. As he stepped into the bright Los Angeles sun, the weight of the flight began to lift. The mission ahead would require his full attention, and he was ready for it. But he would carry the lessons of the flight with him, a reminder that the battle for justice wasn't just fought in high-profile cases. It was fought in everyday moments, in the quiet acts of resilience that so often went unnoticed. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and walked forward with purpose. The mission awaited him, and he was ready. Ethan moved through the bustling terminal of Los Angeles International Airport, the hum of conversations and the click of rolling suitcases filling the air around him. He had walked away from the confrontation on the plane, but the weight of it still lingered in his mind. As he passed through the crowd, he caught snippets of hushed conversations. He knew that some of the passengers from the flight were probably sharing their version of what had happened. Their voices lowered but tinged with the excitement of having witnessed something so dramatic. They would tell their friends and family about the woman who had caused a scene, about the man who turned out to be an FBI agent, and how justice had been served in an unexpected way. Ethan wasn't interested in being part of their story, though. He had no desire to be remembered as a spectacle or a symbol. He just wanted to move on, to focus on the mission that lay ahead and leave the ugliness of the flight behind him. But as he approached the exit, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Agent Ross?" Ethan turned and saw one of the security officers from the plane approaching him, his expression one of quiet concern. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Jenkins, gave him a respectful nod as he came to a stop. "I wanted to apologize again for what happened back there," Officer Jenkins said, his voice low but sincere. "We didn't handle it the way we should have, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Ethan offered him a small smile, appreciating the gesture. "You were just doing your job," he said. "No harm done." Jenkins sighed, clearly still bothered by the way things had unfolded. "It's just, we get these kinds of complaints sometimes, and you never know who's telling the truth. But I should have listened better. That woman, she was out of line, and we should have handled it sooner." Ethan nodded, understanding. He had spent years in law enforcement. He knew how quickly situations could spiral, how difficult it could be to discern the truth in the heat of the moment. "You did the right thing in the end," Ethan said. "That's what matters." Jenkins looked relieved by Ethan's words, but there was still a lingering sense of discomfort in his eyes. "If there's anything we can do, anything at all, just let us know." Ethan shook his head. "I've got everything I need. Thanks, though." With that, Jenkins gave a final nod and turned to leave, disappearing back into the crowd. Ethan watched him go, feeling a mixture of empathy and frustration. The truth was, Jenkins had been caught in a difficult situation. But what bothered Ethan wasn't just the way things had played out. It was the fact that situations like this happened at all. He had spent his life rising above the expectations people placed on him, proving his worth over and over again. But no matter how hard he worked, there would always be someone like Linda Westbrook, someone who saw him not for who he was, but for what they assumed him to be. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to shake off the heaviness that clung to him. He had learned long ago that he couldn't carry the weight of every injustice he encountered. He had to keep moving forward, and so he did. As Ethan stepped out into the warm California sun, he found a quiet spot just outside the terminal and sat on a bench, letting the rays wash over him. The noise of the airport faded into the background, and for the first time since the flight, he allowed himself to truly relax. His phone buzzed again, another message from his supervisor, Mike Sanders. "Everything good? Need to check in before the briefing?" Ethan typed out a quick response. "I'm good. See you soon." He put his phone away and leaned back on the bench, his thoughts drifting. The mission in Los Angeles was important, high with a lot riding on its success. But for now, he was focused on something deeper, something personal. He thought about Sarah, the young woman who had stood up for him on the plane. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene, and when she did, it had surprised him. It reminded him that, while there were people like Linda in the world, There were also people like Sarah, people willing to speak up, even when it was uncomfortable. He thought about the passengers who had sat in silence, some of them clearly torn between their own discomfort and their desire not to get involved. Ethan didn't blame them. He understood how fear and uncertainty could paralyze people. But he also knew that silence in situations like this often allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. Most of all, he thought about Linda, the woman who had caused so much chaos in such a short amount of time. He didn't hate her, despite everything she had said and done. But he pitied her. She had lived her life in a bubble of entitlement, convinced of her own superiority, blind to the damage her actions caused. And now she would have to face the consequences. The image of her being led off the plane by security played in his mind. For a brief moment, Ethan had felt a flicker of satisfaction, a sense that justice had been served. But that satisfaction was fleeting. He knew that people like Linda rarely changed. She would likely walk away from this experience without learning anything, clinging to the belief that she had been wronged. But that wasn't his problem to fix. Ethan had done what he could, and now it was time to move on. Ethan arrived at the FBI field office in Los Angeles just in time for the scheduled briefing. The familiar faces of his colleagues greeted him as he stepped into the conference room, the tension of the flight fading into the background as he shifted his focus to the mission at hand. Mike Sanders, his supervisor, stood at the head of the room, flipping through a file as the other agents gathered around the table. "Ross," Mike said, glancing up with a grin. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Ethan replied, taking a seat and dropping his bag beside him. The briefing began quickly, with Mike outlining the details of the mission. It was a complex operation, one that had been in the works for months, with multiple moving parts. Ethan listened intently, his mind fully engaged with the task ahead. The tension from the flight seemed distant now, replaced by the adrenaline of the mission. As the meeting continued, Ethan felt a sense of clarity return. This was what he had trained for. This was his purpose. The ugliness of the flight had been a distraction, one he had navigated with calm and composure. But now it was time to get back to work. By the end of the meeting, the team was ready. The plan was set, and everyone knew their role. As the agents filed out of the room, Mike pulled Ethan aside. "Everything good on your flight?" Mike asked, his tone casual but curious. Ethan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Had a bit of a situation, but it's handled." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Situation?" "Let's just say I ran into someone who didn't know when to quit," Ethan said, his voice light but carrying an edge of truth. Mike chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Well, I'm glad you handled it. We've got a lot riding on this op, so let's keep things smooth from here on out." "Always do," Ethan replied with a grin. The mission went off without a hitch. Days later, after a long and intense operation, Ethan sat in his hotel room, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The success of the mission was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, why he continued to push forward despite the challenges he faced. But as much as the mission mattered, the flight still lingered in his thoughts. Ethan had always known that being an FBI agent wouldn't shield him from the prejudices of the world. His badge, his training, and his accomplishments couldn't protect him from the ignorance of people like Linda Westbrook. But what mattered was how he chose to respond. He had faced down that ignorance with grace and dignity. He had refused to be drawn into her hatred, choosing instead to let the truth speak for itself. And in the end, the truth had won. The world wasn't perfect, far from it. But moments like these reminded Ethan that change was possible, that progress could be made, even in the smallest of ways. He hadn't changed Linda's mind, but he had shown the passengers on that flight, and anyone else paying attention, that there was power in staying calm, in standing tall in the face of injustice. Ethan stood from his chair and walked over to the window, looking out at the lights of Los Angeles stretching far into the distance. The city pulsed with life, with people living their lives, with stories being written and rewritten every day. And his story, his mission, was just one of many. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he was ready to face them, just like he had always been. With a deep breath, Ethan turned away from the window and began to pack his bags. It was time to move forward. Thank you for following Ethan's journey in Above the Clouds. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more compelling stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue to build this community together.